We've seen before that the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are considered to be deeply related and are called the Deuteronomistic history. And we've seen that this Deuteronomistic history is also related to Jeremiah, whose scribe was Baruch. The book of Deuteronomy, which kicks off the Deuteronomistic history, is the farewell discourse of Moses. It's his last sermon. And his sermon has one point: keep the covenant that God has made with you, and you will be blessed. But fail to keep the covenant, and you will pay a steep, steep price. Towards the end of Deuteronomy, we find this warning about what will befall the Israelites if they fail to uphold their end of the pact. Yahweh will make you and the king whom you set over you go to a nation that you haven't acknowledged, you or your ancestors. There you'll serve other gods, wood and stone. You'll be something shocking, an object lesson, and a subject of taunting among the peoples where Yahweh drives you. And it will beseech you in all your communities until the fall of your lofty and fortified walls on which you're relying. In the entire country, it will besiege you in all your communities. In the entire country that Yahweh your God has given you, you'll eat the offspring of your womb, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom Yahweh your God has given you, in the siege and in the stress that your enemy puts on you. Those words were said to have been uttered by Moses before the people ever entered into the land of Israel. And yet, somewhere around 800 years later, these words are fulfilled. For, as we've seen in the long narrative of commandment violations, the first commandment and the second commandment were broken in the book of Exodus with the golden calf. The third commandment was violated in the book of Leviticus when the son of an Israelite woman blasphemed the name of God. The fourth commandment was violated in Numbers when someone gathered sticks on the Sabbath day. The fifth commandment was presented as case law in Deuteronomy, as what should happen if a child was found to dishonor their parents. The sixth commandment, according to Jeremiah's ordering, was violated in the book of Joshua when Achan stole from what was to be God's from the city of Jericho. The seventh commandment, according to Jeremiah's ordering, was violated in the book of Judges when the Levite's concubine was savagely murdered. The eighth commandment, according to Jeremiah's ordering, was violated in the book of Samuel when David committed adultery with Bathsheba. And the ninth commandment was violated in the book of Kings when Jezebel got two people to serve as false witnesses against Naboth. With commandment after commandment violated in book after book, one after another, the ominous words of warning from Deuteronomy came to life. In 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army rolled up to the gates of Jerusalem. They laid siege to the city until the walls failed. The Babylonians brutally murdered men, women, children, and the elderly in the streets. They utterly ransacked the city, destroying its protective walls, its royal palace, its holy temple. Some survivors of the siege were taken back to Babylon to live out their days as slaves. They were given new Babylonian names. They were forced to violate the laws of kosher food and eat the Babylonian food. In short, it wasn't just enough to defeat them and to destroy their homeland, but the Babylonians also sought to squeeze out everything that made the Jewish people Jewish. They had been slaves in Egypt, and now they're slaves in Babylon. They are right back where they started. Way back in Genesis, they were in the city of Babel, building a great tower to the heavens. And now they're back in Babylon again, right back where they started. It's like they've gone nowhere. Not everyone was taken back to Babylon, though. Some people were left behind to try and eke out a living in the rubble of Jerusalem. There was a major famine, poverty the likes of which had never been seen before in the ancient Near East. It was brutal and awful. And while they were all living in the wake of this destruction, Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, was putting all the pieces together. They didn't end up in this desperate position by mistake or chance. They didn't end up here because God had been unfaithful or had somehow forgotten about them. They had been warned that this would happen if they forsook their covenant with God. And with commandment after commandment, they did in fact forsake that covenant. And there they were, a nation in absolute ruin. So, this long, intricate pattern of commandment violations is kind of like a sermon. It shows the long hand of God at work amongst his people and the long pattern of faithlessness by those very people. And while it's certainly a fire and brimstone sermon, there is a little glimmer of hope. For back in the later chapters of Deuteronomy, that long farewell sermon that Moses gave, Moses charts a path forward for the people sitting in Babylon and sitting in the dust of Jerusalem. He says, "But when all these things come on you and you bring them back to mind, among all the nations where Yahweh your God has driven you away and turned back to Yahweh your God and listened to his voice in accordance with everything that I am ordering you today, you and your children, with your entire mind and with your entire being, Yahweh your God will bring back your good fortune. He will have compassion on you and again gather you from all the peoples where Yahweh your God has dispersed you." The sermon that Baruch gives is a descriptive sermon. This is how we got here. But it's also a prescriptive sermon. This is how we get out of here. If we turn back, God will bring us home. And that's what happens eventually. 70 years after Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Israelites and destroyed Jerusalem, King Cyrus of Persia defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus let the people go back home. He gave them money to rebuild their land, their city, and their temple. And for a while anyway, the people had a kind of great religious revival. The scriptures that will eventually become the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, are finished, edited, and compiled. The worship of God resumes in the temple in the holy city of Jerusalem. And life kind of goes on. Thus, Baruch's sermon seems to be simple. If we stay faithful to the covenant, God will bless us. And if we don't, then we're going to have troubles. I'll say, though, Christians could look at this sermon from a slightly different direction. St. Paul, in his epistles, says over and over again that while God gave us the law, it was proved over and over again that we could never actually manage to keep the law. As humans, we're just constitutionally unable to hold it together for too long. We wander, we lust, we stray, we forget. And this long pattern of commandment violations might just be the ultimate example of that for us. Even great figures like Aaron and David couldn't keep their act together. And if they can't, then how can we claim to be any different? Thus, St. Paul says God issues a new covenant that doesn't require us to do that which is impossible for us to do, a new covenant which simply requires faith, a new covenant which is forged on the cross by Jesus in his death and his resurrection. Thus, God's blessing on us isn't dependent on our fidelity to the laws, but in our recognition of our sinfulness, our shortcomings, and belief that Jesus' death covers those very sins. There is, of course, one final little detail that we need to figure out before we're done this journey, though, right? I mean, they broke 9 commandments, but aren't there 10? But before we do that, take some time to consider this long sermon and what it must have taken for Baruch to have pulled this off.